We good? Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. Just going to take a deep breath here and settle in and see all of your beautiful faces. Thank you for coming out on this beautiful Saturday spring afternoon. This is the fourth installment of our Living Future Saturday spring semester and the final event of our spring season, which is our first season, so it's very exciting. If you've joined us before, welcome back, and if you're joining us for the first time, I'm glad you found us. My name is Sarah Rose Nordgren, and I'm the founder of the School for Living Futures, an experimental interdisciplinary organization here in Durham, dedicated to creating new knowledge and possibility for our climate-changed future. As an invocation today, I'm going to open with a poem by the wonderful American poet Camille Dungy, who is a favorite poet of mine. It's called Characteristics of Life, and it has an epigraph from BBC Nature News that says, "A fifth of animals without backbones could be at risk of extinction," say scientists. Ask me if I speak for the snail, and I will tell you I speak for the snail. Speak of underneathedness and the welcome of mosses, of life that springs up, little lives that pull back and wait for a moment. I speak for the damselfly, water skeet, mollusk, the caterpillar, the beetle, the spider, the ant. I speak from the time before spinelessness was frowned upon. Ask me if I speak for the moon jelly. I will tell you one thing today and another tomorrow, and I will be as consistent as anything alive on this earth. I move as the currents move, with the breezes. What part of your nature drives you? You in your cubicle ought to understand me. I filter and filter and filter all day. Ask me if I speak for the nautilus, and I will be silent as the nautilus shell on a shelf. I can be beautiful and useless if that's all you know to ask me. Ask me what I know of longing, and I will speak of distances between meadows of night-blooming flowers. I will speak the impossible hope of the firefly. You, with the candle burning and only one chair at your table, must understand such wordless desire. To say it is mindless is missing the point. I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the territory of the Eno, Shakori, and Tuscarora peoples who have stewarded it throughout the generations to this day. May we aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. And I'll also speak my gratitude for everyone who's helped make this series possible, including my wonderful family, new and old friends, and all of the people who've attended in person and online this season with open hearts and minds, bringing knowledge, questions, and ideas, including all of you here today. Special thanks to Carrie Elsie over there, proprietor of Perfect Lovers, who believed in the idea for this series and provided this fertile space for us to gather in. This event would not exist with all of your support. Please silence your devices if you haven't already, and also please feel welcome to make this experience comfortable for your body in whatever way you need. So, since one of the main purposes of this series is to build community and learn from one another, my sister Krista is going to lead us in a discussion activity before we move on to the main event. Welcome, Krista.
Thank you. We're going to do a couple of activities. And the first one, you don't have to close your eyes yet, but I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. And I'm going to ask you to then raise your hand and open your eyes when you feel like a minute has passed. And I urge you not to count in your head if possible. And I actually need my phone. And so, yes, does everyone understand? We're going to close our eyes. And when you feel like a minute has passed, you can open your eyes as you raise your hand. Are we ready? So close our eyes and start now. Thank you. So our first people raised their hand at 29 seconds, and there are a couple of you. And then we had another big wave at 45 seconds, and our very last person at 1 minute and 29 seconds. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to ask you is to again close your eyes, and we're going to do a little visualization exercise. And I'm going to ask you to imagine that you're somewhere in the downtown of a city that you're familiar with. It could be Durham, it could be anywhere. Just a spot that you really can sort of picture in your mind's eye looking out. So just imagine yourself there. You can go ahead and close your eyes now. Imagine yourself there comfortable. You're seeing what you see. It's the present day. May 2023, and you're looking out to this part of downtown. And now I want you to fast forward in your mind to that same place in 10 years. What changes in that place? Do the people look different? Do the storefronts look different? Do the roads look different? And now I want you to imagine that same place. We're fast forwarding 50 years. What do the people look like? What does the built environment look like? And now 150 years. And now 500 years. And now 1,000 years. And now 10,000 years. One million years. And when you're ready, you can come back to the space. And I want you to find a group, maybe of 3 or 4 people, if you can include someone you haven't arrived here with, and talk about where does your imagination fall off in that visualization? Like where does it end for you? That's one question. And the other question is, what do time scales have to do with your climate work? How do time scales show up in the work that you're doing and your imagination for the work you're doing right now for the climate? Okay, you can find your group. I'll give you guys just a couple seconds to wind down. Oh, really just a couple seconds. I wonder if there's anything that people want to share. Usually after these, we have a little sharing. Are there any sort of common themes or things that came up that surprised you all? You can just raise your hand. Oh, talking to that mic or this mic. Any common themes? Anything that surprised you? Everything was uncommon and there were no surprises. Okay, yeah.
We talked about how up through 50 years or so, we could kind of imagine like more easily what changes might occur. And then there was kind of a blank period between 50 years and maybe, 1,000 or so years. And then after that, we could start imagining it again because it just wouldn't be there anymore. Anyway, but that there seems to be a maybe imagination like block around maybe 50 or 100 to like in terms of specifics.
We were sitting in the same place in our imagination, just kind of medical, but mine became underwater. And it was a desert. And like it just kept being a desert. And mine kept being an ocean.
Yeah, difficulty, the comment was difficulty imagining the recent future, no, the near future. The recent future, the near future. But then imagining one person was imagining the desert and one person was imagining it all being underwater and they were imagining the same spot. Okay, thank you guys.
Can I follow up with one more question? I feel like we didn't address the other question about how we think about time scales in the work that we're doing. Does anybody have any thoughts about that? Yeah. Okay, great. We have the reason we're talking into mics is because of the people on the live stream can't hear us if we're just talking in the room, even if we can hear each other. So that's why we're being courteous to our online audience members by using microphones.
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting follow-up question for the imagination activity, and I really dropped off at the 100-year mark.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in coming from like I guess a more university traditional hard science background, that's when climate projections end usually at 2100.
Mm-hmm.
So that's was a pretty hard and definite cutoff for me.
That's a really good point. Like how far ahead are the projections looking at this point? How can we see beyond those? There's a lot of unknowns at this point. Any other comments about how timescales might connect to work that you're doing or the way that you think about climate work? I think it's a great question because I think in what I do think about the future, but I think about it in this sort of more amorphous way, like sort of scattering seeds or something. Anyway, I think it's an interesting thing to think about more concretely what time looks like. Thank you all. Thank you, Krista. So a year ago when I was first in conversation with Krista, who you just met if you didn't already know her, about my dreams for the School for Living Futures, she said, "You have to meet my friend Justin Cook." And a few days later, I met Justin at Gear Street Garden for the first time. And within 5 minutes of introducing ourselves to each other, we were excitedly gushing and gesticulating about whale bones and deep time. Over the past year, Justin has become a friend and an inspiration and an important thought partner. His scientific mind gets super jazzed about ideas and details, but his poetic mind also sees the deep connections and metaphorical resonances between them. I feel that he is a kindred spirit to me and to the School for Living Futures, and I'm very happy to share him with you today. Justin Cook is a journalist, photographer, and artist based in Durham. His long-term photographic essays and narrative journalism projects tell stories about resilience in communities living along the edges of America, often by focusing on environmental issues and climate change. He believes storytelling that not only shines light on these issues, but also investigates solutions is crucial in order for humans to live in a better relationship with the planet. Justin is a 2006 graduate of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill School of Journalism and Mass Communication. He's a multiple Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting grantee, and his work has been funded by the Solutions Journalism Network Climate Solutions Fellowship, the North Carolina Arts Council, the Puffin Foundation, and honored by the Magenta Foundation, Pictures of the Year International, the Society of Environmental Journalists, the Society of Professional Journalists, and American Photography. His clients include Duke University, The Guardian, the Marshall Project, the National Audubon Society, National Geographic, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others. When he's not making photographs, you can find him hunting for fossilized shark teeth in eastern North Carolina. This is true. You should follow you should follow him on Instagram and you will see. I'm gonna hopefully not too awkwardly switch our cord into Justin's computer as we transition here, and then also we do an activity here, a response activity called Frames. If you haven't been here before, just be thinking as Justin is presenting and as Danielle is presenting later of what you would be underlining if you were reading with a pencil in hand. Just what resonates for you, what stands out for you, what do you want to remember. And after the presentation, there'll be a chance for us to all sort of share those things, put them into the space so we can kind of hold them in our mind and frame them. And then later at the end of the program, after both presenters, we'll have a time for Q&A for both presentations. So welcome, Justin.
Thanks for the great introduction there. And that sort of imagining time exercise is a really good segue. I was asking for my password. Fun. Cool. It worked. So I'm Justin. That was a great introduction. I'm going to turn this program on so my computer doesn't fall asleep. Really excited to be here today. I am going to show you some work from a journalism project that I've been working on for the past 4 years. It has not published yet, so y'all are getting a sneak peek at something that should publish at the end of the month or early June. I'm going to get into it here, if it will let me. Hang on. The work is funded by the Pulitzer Center and the Solutions Journalism Network. They have a climate solutions cohort that I'm a part of. And essentially, for the past 4 years, I've been working on a 3-part reporting project in Princeville, North Carolina, which is the oldest town in America founded by formerly enslaved Black people. People forced to live in a swampy floodplain. Flooding from the Tar River unleashed by hurricanes and worsened by climate change threatens to erase this historic town from the map. The project, again, is a partnership between the Pulitzer Center Solutions Journalism Network and NC Newsline. I don't know if y'all have ever heard of NC Policy Watch. They're like an amazing watchdog journalism outlet here in North Carolina. They do incredible environmental journalism and climate reporting. They're now on NC Newsline. And my old editor, Lisa Sorg from the Indie Week, is my editor for this project, and she's a total badass. Love her so much. Big shout out to Lisa Sorg. So I'm going to show you just a really quick run through of some photographs from Princeville, and then we're going to really get into the meat of the story, which is something entirely different. So the main story explores how these floods happen in Princeville from the Tar River, how climate change makes them worse, what the town and locals are doing to adapt to climate change. These are actually some sharecroppers from some archival photos I dug out of the Edgecombe Memorial Library, not too far from Princeville. So essentially, what the town and like individuals are doing to adapt to climate change and flooding, but also peoples whose lives have been upended by the flooding. This is a home in Princeville that was flooded by Hurricane Matthew that's still there. You can see the mold from the water line, the height of the flooding. This is Marquetta and Kendrick. They founded an organization called Freedom.org. Danielle knows all about them. We love Freedom.org. They're doing amazing work in Princeville, in the Tar River. Portrait of them. Just two of many individuals in the town that are kind of working to make the town more self-sufficient and adapt to flooding. Mayor Jones, Bobby Jones, he came into office just before Hurricane Matthew, and has had like a really challenging time helping the town recover. This is him at the levee that does not actually protect the town, even though it's supposed to. Ann Adams, she grew up in Princeville, lived there all her life. She isn't part of this completely mismanaged, corrupt rebuild NC program that is supposed to help hurricane survivors get back into their homes, but it has absolutely failed to do so effectively. And we've been reporting with her and essentially trying to get them to do something about her house. We made a little bit of progress, so hopefully by the time the story publishes, the construction on her house will be fully underway. Kendrick, one of the stories we're working on with Kendrick is about his organic farm. And since it's a climate solution story, focusing on how his farming techniques actually help sequester carbon dioxide in the soil, which is one of the biggest carbon sinks on Earth. Black farmers have been doing this for a long time. They have a lot of answers to these issues, but they, have had to deal with like land theft, lack of reparations, and lack of funding. And basically governments don't actually support them. But the story also just kind of captures like daily life in Princeville as well, whether it's through historical photos or the rodeo dance at True Vegas Event Center on a Friday night in February, which is the place to be. Just saying. They had like a Western rodeo dance night there. So like all the rodeo like dance crews from the Tarboro and Rocky Mount came out. I mean, like sassy old like 70-year-old women like just getting down and two-stepping to hip hop, and it was just. I called my friend Cornell Watson in Durham. I was like, "Yo, you gotta get to Princeville. I know it's 11 o'clock at night." And he like got in the car and drove down, and we like photographed it for like 3 hours. And then we were like, "Should we go to Waffle House?" And he's like, "No, dog, I'm too tired. Let's go home." But the story I want to talk to you about today is about Princeville, but it's also really about the land that it's situated on in Edgecombe County. It's so basically how this land was shaped over millions of years by the ocean. And I call this story the Whales of Fishing Creek. Fishing Creek is one of the main tributaries to the Tar River. And a lot of destruction to Fishing Creek has what actually exacerbates some of these floods when the Tar River actually floods the town. This story actually begins with fossil hunting, and I'm really glad my brother is here today. We're twins. He is my fossil hunting partner. That's right. Give him a little. It began with fossil hunting in a vision, and we'll get to the vision towards the end. But I'm essentially going to take you through an adventure through deep time, which made this exercise pretty perfect. But one of the first things I want to ask is, who in here likes whales? Okay, cool. So I was about to say, if someone didn't answer their hand, I wanted to know like who hurt you. What if I told you that whales are crucial to mitigating the climate crisis? All right, we got some people nodding along. Cool. You're probably wondering what Princeville has to do with all this. Well, essentially, as this slide says, Princeville was located 100 miles from the modern Atlantic coast, but it's situated over a prehistoric coastline from the Pliocene epoch, which is 3 or 4 million years old. Scientists are fascinated about the Pliocene because essentially in the mid-Pliocene warm period, so about 3 million years ago, atmospheric carbon levels were the same as they are now, so around 420 parts per million. sea levels were 70 feet higher and an ocean covered Princeville. And there were basically whales and sharks, really gigantic sharks swimming over where Princeville is today. But these same hurricanes that flood the town erode these massive whale bones and shark's teeth, as you can see over here. I built an altar of some over here you can kind of check out of the riverbanks. And it's a prime place to go fossil hunting. But it reveals an ancient marine world buried underneath Edgecombe County. So this is a vertebrae from a cetothere, which is a extinct species of Pliocene whale, which is they're sort of a family that are ancestors to modern humpback whales, fin whales, basically big baleen whales that grew gigantic during the Pliocene, and we'll kind of get to that. This is a massive cotton field, literally right next to the place where I found that vertebrae. And cotton plays a key role in this story because essentially the story of whales and whaling in America is interconnected with cotton and with slavery. Essentially, whales are entangled in the climate emergency story because their fate dovetails with chattel slavery, with sugar, with cotton, and with coal, which are essentially key industries that drove colonialism, which is what created the climate crisis. It made possible the modern extractive racial capitalism, as Danielle calls it. Racial capitalism is crucial to think of it that way, that essentially destroyed southern landscapes and birthed our climate crisis. I kind of spell out how this happened here. Essentially, if it wasn't for cotton, there wouldn't have been an industrial revolution. You wouldn't have had an a climate crisis without these particular genocides against Black people, Native Americans, and whales. And the way this works is essentially like when these big industrial factories were built, they had to find a way to keep the machines lubricated. And whaling was the number one way they did that. They basically used whale oil to lubricate these machines, where they spun cotton picked by enslaved people in the South, including Edgecombe County. These factories belched carbon dioxide into the sky. They led to the expansion of empires and capitalist economies, and ultimately our climate crisis. But we're going to talk about the Pliocene. So this is like the deep time spiral. It's like kind of a more appropriate way to look at time as opposed to like thinking about it in a linear fashion, because at the end of the day, like the Pliocene is somewhat prophetic and history repeats itself and time repeats itself. So it's about 3 to 4 million years ago. This kind of gives you an idea of what we're talking about. So this pink line is the western Piedmont Fall line. So it separates the Piedmont from the coastal plain, but it's also an ancient shoreline from the Pliocene known as the Orangeburg Scarp. And you can kind of see Princeville and Tarboro right here on the Tar River, which it's basically smack in the middle of the Yorktown Formation, which is essentially a layer of marine sediment that was deposited as the sea rose and fell across North Carolina over a period of like 2 to 5 million years ago. So that's that blue area sort of in the middle of the state. And this is what it looks like. This is actually the bank of the Tar River where it's been exposed. These are 3 million year old shells just spilling out of the creek bank. But what's really fascinating about this stuff is that these prehistoric ocean deposits, they're cut through by rivers like the Tar and tributaries. They hold this archive of evolution. That if we study it, we can learn a lot about like the prehistoric past and potentially the future. They essentially have a memory. They're portals, for lack of a better word. And often, like where my brother and I fossil hunt, these creeks and rivers will be like in the middle of the forests, like in the woods. Some of them were like further away from land. Some of them were closer to the road, that sort of thing. But Danielle and I talked a bunch before our presentations today, and there's some direct relationship she'll get into in her project about how like these wooded areas are sort of enchanted and haunted and full of memory. And this is just one memory that they hold from 3 million years ago. This is a really large megalodon shark tooth that Elena was here with me when I found that. Pulled it right out of the riverbank and started screaming. And that's another one. I named that one Buffy the Whale Slayer, because megalodons ate cedotheres and smaller rorqual whales like humpbacks and stuff like that. And there's your evidence. That's actually a piece of whale jawbone with teeth marks on it from a megalodon. These are two different species of white shark. One on the right is a great white, and the one on the left is a sort of the species that existed before it, and it evolved into a white shark because of climate change. Essentially, oceans grew colder. They competed with megalodons for the same food source. They grew serrations in their teeth, and were basically megalodons went extinct because of competition from these animals. So, but you can learn all about that here in North Carolina, just in the rivers. And this is what my brother and I call a whale spud. It's actually part of a whale's inner ear bone called the bulla bone. This is from an extinct species of rorqual or some sort of like baleen whale. And that's another piece of an ear bone. These things are really weird when they break. They actually look like a human earlobe when they get shattered and eroded by the river. It's kind of creepy. Another thing that's really cool about these layers is that they're full of carbon, like basically calcium carbonate and phosphate. And there was a massive cotton boom in Edgecombe County in the mid 1800s because they realized this stuff was fertilizer. So they sent enslaved people to the creeks and rivers to dig this stuff out, most likely some of the same places that we fossil hunt. And there was actually, I think cotton like in Edgecombe County like tripled or quadrupled in output once they realized they could marl, basically use this marine marl stuff and compost. So there's this, literally the dust of the Pliocene, these extinct creatures like lives on through like the clothing, the food, the things that like built us and our ancestors. And they still use phosphate and stuff like that from the mines in Eastern North Carolina as fertilizer. This is actually a whale arm bone. It's like the humerus bone. Would have been like equivalent to this part of a human arm. Big vertebrae. This next one's wild. It's a C3 vertebrae. It's like the neck vertebrae from a minke whale. So a minke whale is sort of like a smaller baleen whale. Very closely related to these old cetothere ancestors. So we're going to talk about how whales are part of the climate solution. Essentially, they have this like reciprocal relationship with plankton. And that's a lot to read and a lot for me to like read to you. But the cliff notes are that basically phytoplankton create 50% of the oxygen we breathe by basically consuming CO2 and sunlight. And that carbon that they suck up from the atmosphere gets passed up the food chain through krill and through fish into these giant baleen whales. And these whales essentially like die and fall to the seafloor and lock all that carbon away for millennia. And it's kind of an amazing process. They call it the whale pump. So essentially, like 40% of our CO2 emissions every year get sucked up by these little plankton, and these giant whales like swim around. They lunge feed these massive swarms of zooplankton, and they sequester all this carbon in their bodies. This is what phytoplankton looks like. I actually went to the UNC Marine Lab and photographed some with a microscope. They're actually really beautiful. This is a picture of me trying to explain all this to you right now. Yeah. All right. People, they're not falling asleep, so that's good. It's me trying to explain the whale poop climate connection, because what's really cool about these animals, essentially, whales, their reciprocation is that whales poop a lot. These big baleen whales poop all over the surface, like constantly pooping. So I went out to California last November and was trying to photograph humpback whales, and sure enough, I caught one diving and pooping. And their poop is full of iron, which is a crucial nutrient in the sort of water column for plankton. So the whales eat the larger zooplankton, these small fish, and then they poop everywhere. And this reciprocal relationship, it sort of fertilizes the water column and phytoplankton bloom. So basically scientists, this is some really delicious whale poop. I know y'all weren't ready for this on a Saturday, but here we are. Anyways. So, yeah. This is the key point. The idea is save the whales again. According to the IMF, if we were to basically restore whale populations to they were before like pre-industrial whaling numbers, basically it would increase phytoplankton populations. It would be the equivalent to 2 billion mature trees appearing on the planet sucking up CO2. They could sequester like 1.7 billion tons of carbon from the atmosphere annually. And this is like some emerging science that they're just now trying to understand. But I think it's really important as journalists to figure out, well, how do we illustrate these things? How do we show people that essentially the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, and like our crises with like racial justice are kind of all entwined, and they're actually one big crisis? Because the same mindset that led white people to enslave Black people, to kill whales en masse, to found basically create an apartheid town like Princeville. It's the same mindset that created the climate crisis. Okay, this is really fun. Hang on a second. This actually is from 2 weeks ago. This is a 50-foot long fin whale that I filmed with a drone. And there's no audio because drones don't do audio. But these animals are twice the size of what these extinct whales were. And because of these, essentially this really warm, hot Pliocene epoch that slowly cooled into the Pleistocene, into the Holocene, into the people, what they call the Anthropocene today, evolved to get really large like this because of this increased productivity and lack of predators. So these whales that essentially, the first whales emerged in the Eocene, Eocene, about 50 million years ago, when basically our climate was a hothouse. So like you're talking 4, 5, 6, 7 degrees like Celsius, like global temperatures. So whales, like they know what it's like to live in a hot climate, but the changes we've made to our atmosphere, this sort of chemical experiment we're doing, isn't like anything they've experienced. So climate change is a huge risk to whales, but whales also know things we don't. They've been around a lot longer than we have. The ocean has covered eastern North Carolina for millions of years, and we're essentially a speck and all that. But there's just so much we don't know. But I want to show you, let me show you these last two. So this whole idea of vision, a lot of times when I fossil hunt, the past and the present kind of like fold over with the future, and my imagination and reality sort of bleed together. And I keep having this vision of like standing in the creek, looking out over the tree line and daydreaming, driving home past cotton fields blowing by the window, and just thinking about like all the whales and whale bones that are buried beneath all these cotton fields and sort of the secrets and the memories they hold. And I wanted to find a way to illustrate that. And I kept imagining these whales like swimming through the sky, over the woods, over the old plantations, through deep time itself, like over Civil War battles, over slave rebellions, over the old Victorian homes in Tarboro, over Princeville. So I had hired an illustrator to like illustrate this as the main art for the story, and this is the first time anyone's seeing it publicly. So it's a river baptism with a bunch of rorquals and cedar swimming over it. And the baptism image, I hired an illustrator, Bex Glendening. She's amazing. She was based in the UK. And the idea was like, so often I hear people in Princeville talk about how the Tar River and the flooding baptized them. And they talk about it very differently. So I was trying to think like, how do we portray that? But there's a picture of me fossil hunting, looking like a dork. I have a whale shirt on, a fanny pack, basically a fashion icon. Do what I can. But the point of this presentation, like, a lot of climate reporting stresses me out. Not because the doom and gloom, we need to understand that stuff, but like there's a lack of imagination and a lack of connection between ideas. And one of the things I'm trying to do in my work is sort of rekindle that sense of imagination and like childlike wonder about like how amazing like this planet is, like how resilient things are, how much terrible damage we've done to it, but trying to imagine different futures for ourselves, and imagine like the people that we have white people that have like worked so hard to marginalize, imagining them like having a more central role, having our nature restored and people like living in a more symbiotic way with the natural world, because what we're doing right now isn't working. And a lot of this fossil hunting, it's helped me kind of come to grips with like my own climate emotions. I don't know if you've ever heard of Britt Ray. She's a climate psychologist. She has this really amazing newsletter called Gen Dread. It's basically about like reaching people who, trying to talk to them about climate emotions and climate psychology. But she has this quote that the vastness of the cosmos puts the inconsequence of our civilization into sharp and calming focus. And when I think about deep time, trying to imagine the Pliocene Ocean over eastern North Carolina, like just kind of like close your eyes and think about like, what would that look like? What would it look like if none of that was there? Like that sort of childlike wonder, it gives me energy to kind of imagine a future that's better as well. So that's kind of what I got. Basically, at the end of the day, eastern North Carolina is just an old ocean bottom, and we're just trying to live there. So that's the message. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. So before we take a quick break and transition between our two presentations, I would love for us to just take a moment to quickly frame some things that maybe resonated or stood out from Justin's presentation. And you can either use that mic or you can just say from your seat and I'll repeat it for the people who are on our live stream. And I'll just start by saying that, gosh, that image, you told me about what the illustrator was working on and that, I mean, it's just incredible. I think one of the things that really, do what? Oh yeah, if you want to.
I just want to look at it again. I love it so much.
Relevant to that is this idea of time. I loved the image of the spiral of time, but also in addition to the spiral, this idea of time happening in layers and the sort of excavation of these layers, or even just the imagination of these layers, and the story of the enslaved people and the story of Princeville and the story of the whales and how it's connected now and it's also connected in the past and how it'll be connected in the future. Anyway, that was very powerful for me. Other underlines, frames, things that stood out for people. Yes.
At the very end, when he was talking about the lack of imagination in climate reporting, it brought me back to the beginning with the visualization exercise. I think personally, when my time scale in climate work is very what's happening today.
Yeah.
And I think that thinking about needing the imagination and the connection with imagination to bring that time scale out larger, to a longer span, because it's a lot easier for personal actions to speaking for myself, fall by the wayside when it's just in today. And I think that longer scale oftentimes gives me more purpose.
Yeah.
And so thinking about how to reinvent and reinvigorate imagination and all of that in climate reporting and in discussions to help elongate everyone's kind of timeline, I think was cool.
I love that. Yeah, I'll just repeat or summarize briefly the idea of imagination being necessary in climate reporting and the activity we did at the beginning with imagining different time scales and how important it is to use imagination in order to extend the amounts of time that we can engage with in our work. Absolutely. Other frames?
Question clarification on the whole phenomena of the whale up at the top end of it. 40%? Did I hear you say correctly? 40% plankton capture 40%.
They capture 40% of our annual greenhouse emissions.
Emphasizing that the plankton capture 40% of annual carbon emissions. I mean, that's pretty incredible.
They actually make 50% of the oxygen we breathe.
And make 50% of the oxygen we breathe. Thank you, Plankton. Give it up for Plankton, everybody. What? Okay, so we're going to take 5 minutes for you to stretch, move. The restrooms are right there, and we're going to transition to our next presenter. All right, everybody. Oh, if people will start to find their seats again, we are going to move forward or move in a spiral in layers. We're going to layer ourselves onto our next presenter, which I'm very excited about. So I am now very honored to introduce you to Danielle Purifoy. I learned about Danielle's scholarship through an early conversation with Justin. In fact, when he mentioned her as his dream pairing for this series, when we were talking about this series and I was inviting him to participate, he was like, you know, it would be my fantasy. Have you heard of Danielle Purifoy? I said, no, but I looked her work up immediately and got sucked into reading all of the wonderful, wonderful work that she's doing. Dr. Danielle Purifoy is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She completed a PhD in environmental politics and African American studies at Duke University, a BA in English and political science from Vassar, and a JD from Harvard Law School. Purifoy's current research traces the roots of contemporary environmental conditions in the U.S. South, specifically in Black towns dating back to the postbellum era. She's also written about the legal dimensions of environmental justice and equity in food systems. Purifoy is the former Race and Place editor at Scallywag, a magazine devoted to Southern politics and culture, and a former board chair of the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. She also serves on the board of directors of Inside Climate News. Welcome, Danielle.
Wow, that's so humbling. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you. I did not know that story. Thank you, Justin. This is such an honor to be paired with you today and to have been in conversation with you in these past few months leading up to this. And thanks to all my familiar friends, fam, who are in the space today for coming out on such short notice. I typically don't like to publicize these things, but Justin and I had such a great conversation leading up to this. And I was just like, I never feel like this prepared to like talk about something and feel disengaged with a thought partner. And so I felt like, hey, if you're gonna come to a presentation, like come to this one. So I appreciate it. Okay, so this presentation is called Plantations Are Not Forests. It's meant to be literal. And it's not a metaphor. And I want to actually begin with a bit of a thought exercise for you all. I'm sorry, I'm being a teacher today. But I want to take 3 minutes to have you speak to each other in pairs, whatever feels comfortable, to answer whatever comes to mind off the top of the dome in response to these 2 questions. So one is, what are the differences between a plantation and a forest? And 2, what do those differences have to do with time? And again, this may be all new to you, and that's fine. I'm just curious about your responses. So I'm gonna time you so we stay on time here, have time for discussion, and go. Yeah, a little bit of a shorty. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, I may just move it so that it's like here. Cool. Thank you. Yeah, okay. That's good. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. About 1 minute left. Okay, let's come back together. Let's come back. Let's bring it back. Let's bring it back. All right, so I'm gonna take just a couple of minutes to hear some of your responses. Anybody want to share? Y'all were having lots of discussion. Thank you, Justin, for getting us started.
So a plantation is a violent, managed, extractive, depleted landscape, and a forest is not.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So Justin said that, paraphrasing because I never can remember verbatim, but that a plantation is a violent, extractive landscape and a forest is not. Yeah. Okay. And Anna says that it's ordered toward an economic end. Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah, and plantations being oriented toward the economic end don't have the same ecological function because they're homogeneous, generally the same species, generally the same age, generally no understory, whereas forests have that biodiversity that benefits habitat, carbon cycling, water cycling,
Mhm.
actual functioning landscape beyond economic diversity.
Yeah, thank you. So a forest, in contrast to a plantation, has sort of is a living ecosystem with biodiversity and interconnectedness, carbon cycling, and the like. Yeah, thank y'all. Maybe one final reflection? Maybe the connection with time. What's the connection with time? Does anyone have?
I said that the plantation is more limited in time because it sort of comes quickly and violently and destroys what was there previously. But then at a certain point, it sort of has to be taken back over by nature, by biodiversity at a certain point. So it's more limited in time. I
Yeah.
also said they both have whale bones underneath them.
Excellent. Awesome. Yeah. Sarah said that the plantation is more limited in time because it comes quickly, it comes violently, it exhausts the soil and the landscape and sort of destroys what existed before it. And plantation has a much longer kind of life. Thank you. Thank you all for that. You did. Yeah, we're gonna talk more, about it. So I want to start us off with a quote from the Canadian, Afro-Canadian poet Dionne Brand in her new book called Nomenclature. And this is a line from a poem from that collection. but she also iterated it, right? In a recent interview. And she says, I don't believe in time, I do believe in water. And I think I wanted to give that line today as a kind of starting place, or actually not even a starting place, a sort of pickup from where Justin left us off with today, that really beautiful time spiral that he presented. And water is present and essential, right, to each one of those multi-million year, right, epochs, right, epochs of the earth. And so when Dionne Brand says that she doesn't believe in time, right, time is a construct that we have created for ourselves. And has existed in different kinds of iterations across human history. But water, right, has been around this entire time and cycles, even now, right, cycles at a scale that is sometimes perceptible to us and sometimes not in the sort of shorter time scale, but in this sort of longer, right, scales that Justin was talking about in his presentation. The water comes and it goes and it comes and it goes and it's coming, right, again. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about first to give you sort of introduction into how I got into thinking about plantations and forests to begin with. And then we'll talk a little bit about time, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what I think the forest is, right? And why I think a forest is really important important framework for our time. The stretch of Highway 80 between Montgomery and Selma is a lush landscape almost unbroken by trees. The discernible crops, like the cotton for which the Alabama Black Belt region is infamously known, serve as a decoy of sorts for the crop that takes up the most literal space in the state, timber. Approximately 70% of the land area, or roughly 23 million acres of Alabama, is timberland, 94% of which is owned by non-industrial private forest landholders. 62% of these lands in Alabama are absentee-owned or possessed by landowners who do not reside on or near the land. The visual deceptiveness of the timber industry's presence is achieved by the strong resemblance of tree plantations to forests. Forests are complex, self-sustaining, biodiverse ecosystems which, in addition to providing sustenance to a variety of life forms, including our own, also provide necessary climate regulation and natural barriers against weather events like hurricanes, flooding, and fires. By contrast, tree plantations are monocrop landscapes that are difficult to support without chemical inputs such as pesticides and fertilizers, which are reliant on the petrochemical industry. The trees are planted in rows, and the plantations provide very little biodiversity and viable habitat and sustenance for forest wildlife. Tree plantations are a current iteration of several modes of capitalist relations to Alabama's indigenous forest landscape, much of which was initially cleared in the 19th century for the cotton economy, and, as I just found out, is is also one of the world's top sites to find ancient sea monsters. The Alabama Black Belt was under what's now the Gulf of Mexico, which was then blended with the Pacific Ocean, in the Cretaceous period, which was roughly 65 million years ago. So a good deal before the Pliocene. And so the fossils and the fertilizer, right, that created that fertile black belt soil that made the cotton industry so profitable in that area of Alabama is a direct, right, result from those histories. For many Black people living in the Black Belt, the site of their ancestors' enslavement, mainly on cotton plantations, the contemporary timber economy signals a different iteration of plantation power. Instead of the planter class controlling land and labor in place, Most of the owners in the timberland and the Black Belt and the larger state live outside of the region and the state and employ relatively few people on a consistent basis. The impact of such remote control plantation power persists in its constraints over Black communities' choices for the future of the places where they have long built safety, solidarity, and power. Nevertheless, the freedom praxis of Black communities cultivated for generations preserve the memory of these ecosystems and the relations that are integral to the ultimate physical survival of the region, particularly as industrial extractions precipitate compounding social and ecological consequences. Okay, so that's an introduction to this landscape. The Alabama Black Belt is not alone in this. This is also happening, as I'll discuss in a minute, in eastern North Carolina, right? And some of the same landscapes. This region, you may not know, is called the world's wood basket. We export apparently more timber than any other place in the world, which I did not know. I kind of thought was the Amazon, but not true. This place is just as intimately, right, linked to the timber industry and economy as it was to the cotton industry. Okay, so what is plantation time? I'm going to talk about plantation time, and I'm going to talk about forest time today. My introduction to what I'm calling plantation time actually began some years ago. When I was writing my senior thesis on Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker. These are two giants of the Black freedom movement of the mid-20th century. Fannie Lou Hamer was born in Mississippi and to sharecroppers and became the first delegate for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was challenging the Mississippi Democratic Party at the Democratic National Convention in 1964. She was a massive freedom rights organizer against plantation power in Mississippi. And she got her start because she could read and write as a plantation timekeeper. And I have looked around and around in depth for an actual definition of a plantation timekeeper, and I can't actually find one. If anyone has like a succinct definition of all the things that plantation timekeepers do, please do let me know. But by context, what I've gathered that a plantation timekeeper does is it records the labor and productive output of, for in Fannie Lou Hamer's case, sharecroppers, right, on the land. And in an oral history, Fannie Lou Hamer talked about how when she was about 6 years old, she was playing in the fields around her house, and one of the planters came up to her and asked her if she wanted to pick cotton. And she said, I don't know if I want to pick cotton. He was like, well, if you can pick 30 pounds of cotton by the end of this week, I will take you to the commissary up the street and you can get some Cracker Jacks and you can get some other candies. And so she was incentivized by that to pick 30 pounds of cotton. And she was like, little did I know that that was going to become my life. It was like, I came back the next week and he was like, now I want you to pick 40 in a week, right? And so plantation time is, right, like not limited, right, to this particular period of time that Fannie Lou Hamer is talking about. It is a throwback directly into slavery, right? A throwback directly into the histories of how the indigenous forest lands of places like the Alabama Black Belt, the Mississippi Delta, and High Country, Eastern North Carolina, were leveled, right, for the purpose of this extractive, right, production that intimately, right, tied Black folks to land through their labor, through forms of extractive labor. And so I think about plantation time as this sort of mechanistic relationship to time where your life is determined, right, and highly structured by your labor, whether it's wage labor or not, right, and how much that you can produce. And your worth and your value in the society, right, under plantation time is intimately structured by the level of output, how valuable you are to a ruling planter class. And so a few years ago, back in 2020, I became more intimately aware of this sort of, it's not new, right? The timber industry is centuries old, but a newer iteration of the timber industry in North Carolina through work that I was doing with the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. And so here is a photo of the Enviva biomass plant in Northampton County, North Carolina. If you know it, it's right on the border with Virginia. It is, what is it, Roanoke Rapids? Is that right? Yeah, around, yeah, exactly. So in that region, heavily forested area that has been leveled in various ways just in the past 10 years by the biomass industry. And this industry really caught my imagination because I mean, you know, the paper industry, the lumber industry, all of those industries have very similar extractive function. The difference with this industry is that it's sold as green energy, right? This is sold as renewable, as a kind of environmental good that will help us to ultimately get out of the worst effects of climate change. And I'll show you another. So this is so yeah, all of those, like those are trees, like that's stacks and stacks, right, of trees that are basically ground into what we call wood pellets, biomass. You may have used them for a cookout, right? Like you see them in the Lowe's, right? They're in bags. Like they're not a new thing. But the new thing is that now they're being used to as a substitute for coal and coal-fired power plants. So they are mostly being exported to Europe to meet Europe's, the EU's climate change goals. So yeah, very familiar, right? So I'll talk to you a little bit about this cycle of biomass energy. You know, the idea is that, oh, what happened here? It's showing up for me here. Okay. Oh, no. Okay. I'll just keep talking. Okay. Okay, thank you. So the idea, right, is that as we know, trees, as they have been framed, and it's true, right? Like it's not true. It's just the framing of trees as carbon sinks and stores, right? And so because we can grow trees theoretically, right, the idea is that if we cut down trees, right, to then burn them instead of coal, we can, unlike with fossil fuels, sort of easily renew, right, renew this feedstock, right, of biomass by planting new trees and then essentially harvesting them after 30 to 40 years, okay? So it's, this is the framework, right, that has been in place around biomass for the last 10 to 15 years. And what I'll tell you is that a lot of the externalities, right, the sort of harmful impacts of what it means to level a forest and to replant it with a monocrop are not included, right, in this sort of calculation of what biomass does. And one of the major impacts that became apparent to me through I work with the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, is the actual impacts of the the biomass factories, which are located, they're co-located with the, adjacent to or very near the forests, right, that are being leveled. And of course, uh, disproportionately or overwhelmingly really located in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, mostly Black communities. And so this, I think, is, another version, right, or a continuation of an idea about or experience of plantation time, because rather than, right, maintaining a forest for all of its purposes, right, including the carbon storage, you're leveling, right, these ecosystems and pretending essentially to replant them as though they're the same thing, and ignoring all of the other kinds of impacts that come with it. So what does plantation time feel like? So these are quotes from community members in Black community in Northampton County that's located right adjacent to the Enviva power plant. And they were sold, right, a story from Enviva that this would bring jobs. It's a very, typical story, right? This is gonna bring jobs, but it's also clean energy. So it's not going to pollute, right, your community. It's not going to poison you. And it's totally false. Silverline Alston says the noise, the banging during all hours of the night. The wood pellet plant goes 24/7, 365. And so it's like grinding of trees, constantly trucks, right, bringing the lumber in. Belinda Joyner, who is an organizer with Clean Water North Carolina and is connected to the Environmental Justice Network, one of the main organizers against this industry. She says, we have a gentleman that lives in the area and he says he has to wash his car every 3 days and power hot wash his house every 3 months. And that's the stuff that comes from Enviva. There's a young man that lives out there that says he doesn't cook out anymore because he can see the residue falling from the sky. And then Mr. Richie Harding, who doesn't live right next to Enviva, but lives close to the forest that they are leveling for the wood pellets. There's been a high increase in the amount of animals, bobcats, black bears, coyotes, the sightings more frequent in the Gaston area. So he is having these sort of wildlife encounters in his backyard because these wildlife have been displaced. I've kind of gone through a little bit, I'm just trying to be mindful of time, gone through with you about some of the reasons why this doesn't work. But I want to just sort of point to the two rationales in the center here. The European Union claims that carbon neutrality is achievable through biomass, but they've created a loophole where the imported biomass is not included in their own carbon emissions, right? So when they burn, the biomass, they are like, we don't count the carbon there because the US should count the carbon on our side. And of course, the US is not counting the carbon on our side, right? And then more recently, the science has sort of caught up that biomass at the point of combustion, right? So when it's in the coal-fired power plant, emits actually more carbon than coal because it's less efficient, right? So you have to have more of it to achieve the same amount of energy, okay? It's a quote from Catherine Eglin from Gulfport, Mississippi, chair of NAACP's Environmental Climate Justice Committee, which I feel like hits the nail on the head. If you look at the map of the wood pellet trade states and the former cotton trade states, they are the same. The UK ignored the human rights abuses of the cotton trade with slavery, and now they are imperiling the descendants of that same population with wood pellets. The US South also happens to be the most climate vulnerable region in the nation. Okay, so I wanted to, as I was doing this research, more and more getting more and more agitated, right, about climate change, but also just about these sort of extractive industries that are being put in place in the name of saving us from climate change. I wanted to think more about what the value of the forest is, right? Really thinking about what are forests and why are they important beyond this question of carbon, right? Because from every angle, honestly, right, in our climate conversations, people will say biodiversity, right? But they won't talk about life. They won't talk about cultural significance. They won't talk about what the forest has done, continues to do, and will do, right, forever and ever, right, if we keep them in place. And so I went into a deep dive, and I wanted to understand, if I had some understanding now of what plantation time was, right? What is forest time? And what I found, you should know that I think from the introduction, I study, in particular, I'm very interested in Black folks' relationships to landscapes, the kinds of places they create, the cultural significance of space. And I had never really thought through what Black folks' relationship is to the woods, right, to forests, other than the kinds of horror stories, right, of lynchings, right, and various forms of violence. And so I started to do some archival work. Um, and here's some of what I found in online, but then also big shout out to the Schomburg Center for for study in for research in Black culture in Harlem for some of these images. So what I argue is that the forests have been co-conspirators in Black freedom from the beginning of our presence on these shores. The forests that had to be leveled, that were leveled by hand, right, by enslaved peoples in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, were leveled by hand by these enslaved laborers to create the plantations, but there was still forest left. And those forests actually became spaces of refuge and escape, and spaces where folks could practice religion, as we see here, this image that I can't find the artist for, so if you happen to know, it's called the Hush Harbor. So these were spaces where time shifted, relationship to time shifted. It was a respite, right, from the plantation. It was a space where people may have escaped for temporarily or permanently in the case of maroon communities. It was also a space where, important rituals could happen, like this funeral. A lot of these are undated. They're just part of the digital archive of the Schomburg. There were also celebrations, right? Here's a festival in 1851. All of these, right, connected intimately, right, with these living landscapes. In addition to that, and we can talk more about it in the Q&A, because I know I want to make sure that we have time for this. The connections to lifeways and foodways were really critical, right? The enslaved peoples, right, who were able to escape into these forests or even just go into the forest for brief respite, right, learned a lot about medicines, right, about foods that could supplement their diets. They cultivated land in those forests as well. And those forests were maintained the kind of density that they did through what Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote the book Breeding Sweetgrass, calls these sort of intimate channels of communication, right? We don't have densely populated forests without the kinds of underground networks, right, of fungi and sediment, and sort of life bridgeways and networks, right, that maintain that kind of forest. That kind of density, right, that kind of landscape was essential for escape, right? It was essential for respite. It was essential for carving out these spaces. And even post-emancipation, right, tons of stories about juke joints in the woods when I was in Lowndes County, right? The spaces of respite from sharecropping, right? From any kind of extractive labor on the plantation, always a respite for plantation time. And then, of course, you know, as all of these sort of joyful, right, cultural and really critically important rituals and practices were happening in the forests, cultivated by Black folks across generations, across time periods. There was always, right? So in the archive, I found equal, if not more, right? Illustrations of lynchings, right, and violences. I'm not sharing those. But what I will share is, right, this image of the slave patrol, right, patrolling the forests. And it's always, right, to cut that time off, right? It's always to extract, to put back onto the plantation, come back to plantation time. And so forest time is a lifeline, right? Forest time is spaciousness. It is where we can actually be, to actually, it is a direct link to what I would call freedom. And so now, just to wrap up, so the parallel images, right, of the slave patrols into the forests that, you know, are unknown, just sort of unknown forests in this illustration, have direct parallels, right, to what Atlantans are now fighting, the extraction and leveling of the Welauni forest for the building of Cop City, right, which is, you know, 381 acres of essentially domestic military training facility that will train cops on all sorts of more efficient ways to kill Black people. Okay, like, and will do so, right, as they always have, right, at the expense not only of the people, right, but of the ecosystems that give us life. So I want to just end here, just in honor, right, of Manuel Tortuguita Terán, who was killed by police while defending the forest, and just reflect on these sort of connections, back to Justin's piece about the forests which come from the oceans, right, which could not have, you know, come about if not for the water that came before it, and the intimate, right, interconnectedness of these ecosystems and our relationships to it. And so I'll end again with a quote from Dion Brand: "I don't believe in time, I do believe in water." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. That was incredible, and so interested to, hopefully you guys have some thoughts. I'd love to hear people's thoughts about all of the cool connections between Justin and Danielle's presentation. So briefly, let's frame first, and then let's do a Q&A. I will start by just framing forest time as spaciousness, respite, and freedom. Forest as a co-conspirator for freedom. Yeah. Good. Anything else? Yes.
Just the agileness of plantations, that plantations just create themselves no matter what the era is.
Yes, the agileness of plantations. Yes, that they can sort of be created in all times in all of these different ways. When laws change, when people change, right? Somehow it keeps coming back in a new way.
The absences of this process, the
landowners who are not there.
Yes.
The biomass that is not counted.
Yes, absences, the landowners who are not present, the biomass that is not counted. Yeah, yes,
The slave patrols extracting from the forest and putting that back onto the land.
yes. I'm like, I actually have goosebumps right now. Yes, the extracting from the forest, bringing people back into plantation time. Good. Yes, Maya.
Yeah, just how thoroughly our minds have been colonized. We think of our time only in monetary value when we talk about it, regardless of sort of who we are.
Yes. Yeah, the extent to which our minds have been colonized in the way that we think about time at all, and the way that we experience time, and the way we value our time. It's all pretty plantation timey, isn't it? Yes.
The overlay of the maps of the cotton black with basically this sort of deforestation.
Yes, the overlay of the maps with the cotton plantations and then now the wood pellet or the biomass. Good. Yes.
One thing that stood out to me in the narrative was how early in the story of Danielle Purifoy and this young person at the end, the presence of sort of that plantation culture takes over their life. Whereas Danielle Purifoy at 6 is picking cotton, and this very young person, I don't know how old they are, I'm gonna say 20s, is already losing their life to the plantation culture.
Yes. The lives of young people. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I was just saying that stood out.
Yes, the lives of young people being basically claimed by this plantation time in this system.
The thing that really stood out is like how everyone around the forest plantation is suffering because of it as well. And it's no different than what it was 120, 150, 160 years ago.
Yes. Yeah, that has a larger ramification. It affects everybody around it.
And to tie what he said, what she said, that's one of the reasons why the forest is so important. During these times when these people were suffering so bad, they could go out into the woods and enjoy each other's company.
Yeah.
And not have to worry much about being quartered or having too many people, too many black people in one space.
Absolutely. So the importance of the forest as that place for freedom and spaciousness that Danielle was talking about. Good. I want to, oh yeah, go ahead. Let's do.
And I wanted to, what's your name? Daniel. I really want to emphasize Daniel's point in terms of like for whom or by whom, like who creates these spaces and for whom are these spaces? Because it's inextricably linked with anti-Black violence and devastation.
Yes.
And so not just like freedom and spaciousness, or like an evenness of suffering, you know, that it's plantations, is an anti-Black like geography that like coerces both the earth and Black life as raw material.
Yes.
And that the forest can offer like respite or spaciousness or protection or refuge for Black people.
Yes, absolutely. I wish you had the mic when you were just saying that because it was so beautifully put. The reason, just to remind everybody, the reason I'm repeating everything is just for the live stream. So I wish you said that into the microphone. But yes, specifying that this is an anti-Black system, right? That when I'm repeating spaciousness and freedom from Danielle's presentation, we're talking specifically about an anti-Black system and anti-Black violence, and the forest being specifically a place for enslaved Black people and Black people to be able to find freedom within the plantation system. Sorry, did I?
Piggyback off your point, it makes me think of, I can't remember his name, but the African-American man who was burning in New York City, Christian Cooper. Black people still trying to seek solace, peace in the environment, and having violence inflicted upon them.
Yes.
Like Black murderers, Black hikers, Black people in nature
Absolutely. Yes, thank you. I want to shift this, I want to keep this conversation going and also let questions start happening. So could, Justin and Danielle, could you guys come back up here? And then we can keep piggybacking, and we can also ask questions. And if people could, if they're able and it's comfortable for them, if they could speak into that microphone, just so that people don't have to keep repeating. And if it's not comfortable for you or you don't want to come to the microphone, then you can ask your question, and then maybe Danielle or Justin can repeat it for you. Let's see if I can get this out so I can hand it to them, Brandon. Is that a good idea? I'm going to give this guys to you guys to share.
And this has a long cord and pass it around too.
So, yeah, keep with your flow, but you can also ask questions to both people.
Hi. It's not on.
Oh, sorry. That's also.
It's okay.
There you go, now it's on.
Is it on? Not to be antagonistic, but one of the things I was thinking during Justin's talk was like, ain't no way I would be digging up fossils in a river looking black like I am. And it's something that I actually have taken on as a mission myself personally, is to try and create safe spaces for people Black people outdoors. But that was one thing that did stand up, like, well, I love this work and also ain't no way. And so when we got to Danielle's talk about the forest, it just really resonated for me, in like that tenuous line of trying to find a safe place and maintain it in the forest is really tough.
Yeah, thank you for that, Nia. I mean, it was one of the things that I'm clearly like pretty much at the beginning of doing this work on, like I'm calling like Black forest ecologies. There's this like whole big sort of movement in Black studies scholarship towards thinking about what J.T. Rones, a historian, calls, and Justin Hosby, who's an anthropologist, both Black scholars, calls Black ecologies. And I think that tenuousness, right, is like at the heart of that work, right? Knowing simultaneously, right, the violences, right, the anti-Black violences that happen on the same landscapes where people find refuge, right? And really thinking through the deep interconnectedness of those things, but not eviscerating, right, in the midst of understanding how the violences recur, the kind of spaces, right, however fleeting, that Black folks are able to create. And sometimes not as fleeting, right, because one of the things that I study are Black founded places. And like, even if, a lot of these places, you're not going to find on a map, right? Maps are colonial, right? They're not recognized by the state. You're not going to find a ton of like what we might think of as economic development in those spaces. But those spaces are like there for like centuries. Like they don't go anywhere, right? It's just a matter of how much the group of folks who are the community that is there is willing to fight to sort of sustain the space. And so I am really interested in that, right? Like there are these violences that are always happening, and yet, right, there's this life that's happening that goes outside of, that exists outside of our framework of plantation time and productivity and all of those sort of things, and exists in another kind of realm.
You're about fossil hunting while Black. I think about that all the time when I'm out there, because the history of paleontology in this country